Good evening, and welcome to Doctorpiece Theater. My name is Dr. Dennis Business, and tonight we will complete our dive into Stones to Abbigale. When we last left our hero, Abby had just been accused of causing the school shooting. James told her it wasn't her fault. She felt better. Chapter 19. The next school day, I walked in hand with Abby into the school building and immediately saw most every set of eyes in the room turn to us. She stopped walking, realizing right away why she was being looked at. What Ms. Robertson screamed in front of all the students in the hall had spread around the day prior like an infectious disease. As we walked only a few yards past security, it became clear someone had planned to humiliate Abby the moment they saw her. Our suspicion became a reality when someone ran up to her, throwing a can of black paint to cover her upper body, just falling short of her face. Abby gasped as the paint collided with her clothes. They went to spit on her, but by then, my hand was already impacting the sides of their necks, slamming them to the ground. Everyone began screaming, "Ooh!" A sound I had become sick of hearing every time a slightly stimulating event occurred in their no doubt mundane lives. The security guards were much faster to intervene this time due to us being immediately by the metal detectors. They rushed forward and escorted the three of us to the principal's office. I identified the small, skinny, long-haired boy who threw the paint. It was Chris Jenkins, the class clown who mindlessly insulted the President of the United States during his visit to our school. Out of the three of us now being escorted, he was the only one security had to physically force to follow them to the office, but the guards seemed to drag his little body along with ease. Abby and I stood waiting in Principal Lehman's office. As I wiped the black paint off her neck and chest using paper towels Mr. Lehman's secretary gave us. Abby didn't seem too upset by what happened, but she was worried about the future. In a surprisingly strong voice, she said, "This is only the beginning of it. People aren't going to be able to accept me like you. They never did, and they never have now, and they likely never will." I frowned slightly, wishing I could do something, but felt powerless. She went on to say, "Rumors are like a poison. It doesn't matter what the truth is. What they want to believe, they will believe. When Miss Robertson screamed what she did, she killed my future at this school." I wanted to argue, to give her some hope, but that would mean lying to her. The wounds from the shooting were too deep, and they wanted someone within their reach to blame. I turned to see Principal Lehman through the glass window on his office door. He was flailing his arms at his secretary just outside, likely upset that he had just started his day and a significant incident had already occurred. He then looked over at me, still wiping Abby off. He was so upset, he was for a moment at a loss of words. He just stood there staring at us through the door with his mouth completely open. As I turned back to Abby, I could hear him scream, "Oh my God, why?" He was walking towards us looking at the ground. There was a trail of black paint leading to his office. Abby and I couldn't have avoided getting it all over the place due to the security guards ordering us to walk in. Opening the door angrily, Lehman screamed,
"Where is the idiot who did this?"
Abby and I looked just outside the room towards Chris. Principal Lehman followed our line of sight to see the scrawny little kid shaking like a scared, lost animal in a chair just behind the reception desk. Lehman didn't even care that Chris was already terrified by his domineering presence.
"You little idiot! You're going to be cleaning the carpets till they look better than new. You got me?"
Lehman yelled. With a horrified yelp, Chris screamed, "Yes, sir! I'm sorry!" Lehman, now inches from Chris's face, mumbled something to Chris no one else could hear. Whatever he said, Chris looked traumatized in response. Principal Lehman stood fully upright, turned, and walked back into the room we were in. Slamming the door behind him,
"What the hell happened?"
he screamed. I replied, "Recently, Miss Robertson gave everyone within hearing distance of her office the impression that Abby was partly responsible for the people who were shot last year." He replied,
"She doesn't look like Seth to me."
I added, "Miss Robertson was referring to the notes Abby had written." He belted out,
"I don't care about any of that. The only thing I'm concerned with is the fact that we have a person who, under their own free will, shot up my school. He's behind bars." He continued, "Besides, if she had helped plot any of this, she would be behind bars too."
The cops
already talked to me about it and cleared her name.
We stood there silently, not having anything to say. He then asked,
"Anything else? You were just attacked or what?"
Chris heard the principal through the door and screamed back,
"He assaulted me!"
Principal Lehman looked toward the door and then looked back at us.
"Explain,"
he said. I replied, "After he threw the paint, Principal Lehman interrupted.
"I've heard enough. Get out of here."
I began to leave as Abby began to speak to Lehman. "Principal Lehman, I don't know if..." He cut her off by saying,
"I'll take care of everything. You got it?"
Abby nodded, hoping he knew what she was going to say. As we walked out, I could see Chris glaring at us, only to hear a scream,
"Get in here right now!"
for Principal Lehman. Chris flipped like a light switch, from angry glare to wide-eyed terror. We approached Abby's class, worried that she would face more repercussions for what Miss Robertson had said in the hall. Just then, a voice came over the intercom. It was Principal Lehman.
"It has come to my attention that a lot of you believe a student in our school outside of Seth Wilson, everyone, outside of Seth Wilson, was in part responsible for the shooting that took place here last year."
He then began yelling,
"That is not at all relevant or true, students. And if I see any of you picking on any student, blaming them for the actions of the boy we all know is alone 100% responsible and is now in prison, I will not hesitate to suspend you. For a lot of you, a suspension means repeating this semester."
As he cleared his throat, Abby looked at me with relief.
"Again, whatsoever you may have been told by any students or staff about anyone being even remotely responsible for the shooting outside of Seth is a blatant lie and should be reported to me, as I may deal with those dishonest individuals directly. Speaking of which, Miss Robertson, can you please report to my office? That is all."
The microphone squelched off, and the entire building went silent. Abby looked at me amazed that the principal had shown complete intolerance for what had or would happen to Abby as a result of Miss Robertson's unprofessionalism. Abby? About the paint on your... I began to say, but Abby interrupted. Oh, stop. I'll set a new fashion trend or something, I'm sure. Abby hugged me and said, See you at gym class, hubby. Thrown completely off, I breathlessly said, Hubby? She laughed and walked in her class, closing her door behind her. I returned to my class, and Mr. Hanson was to no surprise, sweating from his forehead while reciting more boring facts about Washington State. I sat down and immediately began to figure out from his body movements if he was worried about Miss Robertson. I know those two had a pretty close relationship, as far as school stuff goes, but I figured I'd find out after class about how he felt anyway, so I didn't have to look too far into it. Mr. Hanson had us all give reports on a specific part of Washington that we had visited in our lives that we liked. I had nothing prepared, so I just went off the top of my head. Only a few words into telling the class about where I had been, and Mr. Hanson screamed, A+! The class laughed, and I finished telling my story with just a little boost of optimism thanks to his outburst. As I completed teacher's assistant's work for Mr. Hanson, he brought up Miss Robertson just as I expected.
Do you know that whole business was with Miss Robertson?
He asked. I replied, It's really complicated. He then added,
I hope that they fire her.
I was speechless. I thought he got along with her just fine. He could see my disbelief, so he explained, Miss Robertson is one of the most manipulative, judgmental, and positively insane women I've ever met. I'm only telling you this because I've never heard Principal Lehman that angry before, and I'm pretty sure she's getting canned. I replied, I don't know. Like I said, it's complicated. He asked, Why are you so hesitant to speak your mind? I replied, Because it's not about just Miss Robertson. There's a lot more to it, Mr. Hanson. He then smiled and tilted his head back, stretching out his double chin to briefly become one chin.
Oh, it's about your girlfriend, too, he said.
I smiled and replied, Like I said, it's complicated. He jumped forward and interrupted,
Get back to work, you!
But said it with a smile, so I knew he was just trying to ease the tension. As gym class came around, Abby was all cleaned up and looking like her normal self. She was happy to see me, still giggling about calling me hubby earlier. I was so psyched to see her and feeling happy despite all that was going on. Mr. Mack came out and told us, The game of the day is basketball, and if you don't want to play that, you must sit on the sidelines and cheer every time someone scores a basket. We all laughed, and I ran to join in on a game. Abby stood by the side with some other students and cheered for us just like Mr. Mack asked. I think we were all just looking to have fun. Even Ramon was being a good sport. I knew if it were earlier that year, he would have fouled me and other students just to act like he was the victim, if anyone called him on it. Everything we all went through just seemed to bring us closer together. It was like a wall casting a massive shadow, but all any of us could look at was the tiny glint of light shining through the cracks. James. I'd never heard Abby cheer like this before, so seeing her light up every single time I scored a basket gave me a familiar goofy grin and only motivated me to do better. As I played, I kept thinking about how everything could have gone to hell had I given in earlier on. But I was reminded that it wasn't only Abby and I who found ourselves laughing our way through everything, but most of the students in our school. It was if All of the tears shed in our school cleansed us of our differences, bonding us in a way most other schools would never know. Abby and I met the bus and rode home quietly in our usual seat towards the back. She rested in my arms, as if she didn't have a single worry, and in that moment, I found peace as well. As Abby closed her eyes, I stared off towards Davis's old seat. I imagined him cracking jokes and laughing. He could almost always offer endless entertainment. Just then, I felt Abby's hand touch my face. "James," she said in a gentle tone, "are you okay?" I just realized she had her hand on me to wipe a tear away. I didn't even know it had fallen. "I'm fine, Abby." I looked at her, squeezed her gently, and smiled. "I'm fine." My fucking God. Chapter 20. Quite a few days had passed since Abby was doused with black paint. We woke up in each other's arms to the sound of my alarm clock. I wonder why I kept it all this time. It was such a random piece of crap. Sometimes it would go off in the middle of the day. Sometimes it would go off at the right time. Abby and I would always laugh because it had a delightfully annoying little chirp to it. Not so annoying you passionately hate it, but just enough to make you want to shut it off as soon as humanly possible. We normally woke up based on our eternal clocks, which worked because we rarely went to bed at an excessively late hour. Fortunately today, my little piece of junk alarm clock gave me some extra time before the bus arrived. Seeing as we didn't have to leave right away, Abby kissed me good morning and told me she was going to make some eggs. While she cooked, I cleaned up our room. For some reason, her talent for finding the strangest places to discard her clothes made me laugh inexplicably. Her now dried shirt covered in paint was crumpled on the floor. Just looking at it gave me the strangest inclination to fold it into a square and pin it to the wall using thumbtacks. When I was done, Abby walked in with 2 plates in her hands, and I saw the shirt on display. She said, "Well, that looks kind of cool." I replied, "I feel like, at this point, most bad things that happen won't really hurt us unless we let them." She set down the plates and hugged me. I said, "You turn bad things into beauty, Abby." I pointed at the shirt. "It's like the moment that paint hit you, it became perfect." She replied sarcastically, reaching her arms out. "You're gone too deep, James. Where'd you go?" I laughed hysterically, hugging her as she laughed as well. "Thank you, James," she said. I kissed her on the forehead and softly continued laughing. We waited that morning at the bus stop for about 40 minutes before we gave up and returned to our room. Abby tried calling into school, but no one answered, so we turned on the TV, hoping to see if the local news said anything. Before we could even flip to the news station, we quickly found almost every local station was showing the same thing. At first, we thought it was just a random fire, when Abby raised her hand to her face in shock and said, "James, that's our school." I looked at her in shock and then back at the TV to read the scrolling news feed at the bottom of the screen. It read, "Unknown arrest. Unknown arsonist suspected of setting fire that claimed most of Lakewood High." Abby and I were now both staring, sitting at the TV. The feed cut to a ground reporter who had approached a very upset Principal Lehman. As the reporter asked him questions, he kept apologizing to them, following it by,
"I can't comment at this time."
He ended the conversation by saying he had to deal with the situation and spun around looking at the school in disbelief, likely having no idea what his role now was or even how to proceed forward after witnessing his job literally going down in flames right before his eyes. Abby and I spent the days after keeping each other busy at home, all the while expecting a call from a number of the so-called school administration to explain what had happened. We watched the news every day to learn updates on the story. It didn't take the fire department long to figure out how the fire had started. They confirmed it was in fact a result of arson. After talking to the staff in depth, the police were pointed towards the recently fired Ms. Robertson. Just as we learned about her being suspected, our phone rang. I answered on the voice on the other end was of someone representing the school district. They confirmed my name and that I attended Lakewood High, following their confirmation with a briefing.
"As you are well aware by now, the school suffered a major fire and is irreparable at this point. All of your class information and grades were stored in an online database, so none of your information has been lost. Regardless, to make things easier for the staff and the students, we have decided to credit everyone as if they had already finished the year." I asked for clarification, and they confirmed that we would be attending an entirely new school the next year. To my relief, they said we would be proceeding to the senior class with our credits intact. I thanked them and disconnected. Abby and I were both happy to know the only thing the fire harmed was the physical school itself. In reality, not even a janitor was harmed, as by the time the fire had started, he had finished his work and gone home for the night. The administration really stepped up and made sure none of the teachers suffered financially, and the students didn't lose any time. Days later, Abby and I decided to visit the site of our burned-down school. The front was completely cordoned off, so we approached Lakewood High from the back. As we got closer, we could see the gymnasium building completely intact due to it being detached from the rest of the school. As a result, amazingly enough, the jocks were still allowed to use the facility itself and the unscathed field nearby for practice. Although I imagine they were doing it just to stay in shape for the next year. The back area was pretty open, so we were able to walk right up to a point only a few yards away from the fire-damaged area. As we looked on, someone came up behind us saying, "Hey, chump!" I turned to see it was Jason in his sports gear. He had seen us walking in from the field he was actively practicing football on. "Did you see the news?" he asked. I replied, "Last I heard, they were looking for the arsonist." He laughed and said, "Nope, they found her." Abby and I looked at each other and then looked back at him, waiting for us to tell us who it was. Jason threw his arms out and screamed, "It was crazy Mrs. Robertson, dude. She's all locked up now." Abby and I didn't know how to react. "You sure? Last I heard it was speculation," I asked, and he responded, "Yeah, she didn't have to admit it, but she still did. She said the school was like rotten to the core and talked about how the renovations were just a lie, covering up a bigger lie or something like that." There was a silence as the information soaked in, but Abby broke right through it by busting out laughing, throwing her hands to her knees, lurching forward beside me.
I smiled, and Jason gave her a slightly bewildered look. Abby's laugh was rich with satisfaction. It was an obvious victory for her after all the grief Ms. Robertson consistently gave her.
Anyway, so see you at the new school, huh?
Jason asked. I replied,
Yeah, I guess.
Jason then turned and ran back off to the field. Abby's laughter was trailing off now as she returned fully upright.
You okay, Abby?
I asked. She replied with a smile. Yup, hubby. I'm just fine. She and I turned around to continue looking at the burnt school. Suddenly I realized something. A small smirk crossed my lips.
Well, I guess this means I won't be running for president.
This has been Doctorpiece Theater, and my name is Dr. Dennis Business. And as always, my friends,